Hey, Fred, how are you doing?
Pretty good, Angel. How are you doing?
Stove just died.
Oh, that's fun. We've been having ongoing boiler issues for the better part of the year, so I feel your pain.
Like, you're okay now, or?
After many thousands of dollars were doled out, yes,
Wow.
we do have heat.
I got a guy coming in right now. He was supposed to come at 5.
Oh, for your stove.
Yeah, so he
Gotcha.
was so he was supposed to come at 5 p.m. and he just reached out and said, "Hey, I'm in the area." I'm like, "Oh,
Oh, gotcha. Well, that's good, right? In the sense that
yeah,
you'll
yeah."
hopefully have a functional stove earlier. You only have me right now, if that's okay.
Sure,
Crystal,
sure.
Crystal unexpectedly, she's a teacher, and she
Okay.
unexpectedly got a COVID vaccine
Ooh,
appointment. And
okay. So
I,
this
I assume
life happening.
yeah, exactly. So I assume you're a New Yorker, so you know how precious those are. So she's
Oh
running
yeah,
out the door to go get stuck. That's her.
yeah.
She's an essential worker. I am expendable, so I did not get an appointment.
Yeah, just give me 1 second, okay? I'm sorry. Hey, how's it going, man? Oh, thanks for coming, bro. I appreciate it. My wife's talking, my dog's tripping. It's going crazy over here, man. Come here, come here,
It
come
happens.
here. You see this? I'm gonna
Hold
keep
in
this,
there.
man. I'm gonna keep all this craziness in the
That's right. It's real life. It's cinema verite. It's podcast verite.
yeah, that's right. This is like reality podcasting.
The city of New York, Boricua from the Bronx.
My name is Fred Van Lente. I am a writer primarily of comic books. I worked for a long time for Marvel Comics, where I wrote Amazing Spider-Man and Marvel Zombies and Iron Man Legacy and Wolverine First Class and many, many other titles. I'm also known for doing nonfiction comics, such as Action Presidents, which is our middle grade book I do with Brian Dunleavy, which is in stores now. We also did the comic book history of comics, and spinning out of that with my wife, the playwright Crystal Skillman, who has her COVID appointment today. So that's why I'm flying solo. We co-wrote a play called King Kirby about the life of the great comic book artist Jack Kirby, co-creator of the Marvel Universe. And it has been turned into an excellent podcast drama that is streaming right now on the Broadway Podcast Network and on iTunes and Audible and Spotify and Google Podcasts and wherever you get your podcasts.
I actually listened to it last night on Spotify, and it was very cool. I
Awesome.
enjoyed it. It actually gave me some ideas of things that I could potentially do,
Oh, is that
which is,
right?
well,
Oh, from a podcasting standpoint or from
yes,
being a
sir.
comic artist in the Depression?
No, just in terms of expression, the way you guys did it,
Yes.
it was like different characters talking and the storytelling. I'd always been trying to figure out ways of expressing myself, and listening to that last night, I kind of was inspired by that. So there's another added bonus effect of
That's awesome.
of the the play. So this was originally a play, and
Right.
now
It was
you're
written
putting
here in
it.
New York. And it's been done in Calgary and Seattle and DC and San Francisco and a bunch of other places. But this actually is what happened is we funded the first play. The play was put on at something called the Comic Book Theater Festival. And we crowdfunded the money to put on the production through Kickstarter. And one of the things we offered our Kickstarter backers was an audio recording of the show. Now, due to various union regulations, and I'm very pro-union, so we were cool with this, you're not really allowed to film a play and then present it to an audience without paying the actors X amount of money that, quite frankly, we couldn't afford. So instead, what we offered the Kickstarter backers was an audio recording, which we actually did. We recorded the show in Midtown Comics downtown, which is Midtown Comics location on Fulton Street by the South Street Seaport. And so we actually recorded it in a comic book store, which sort of as a sort of an extra sort of excitement. And that was in 2014 when the show was first staged. And there's been a bunch of production since then, but we've all been stuck inside because of COVID. And, there's been such an insurgence and interest in podcasts. What was cool was that someone approached us and said, "Hey, have you thought about adapting this as a podcast drama?" And I grew up, I think I'm a bit older than you, and I grew up listening to like my dad had like recordings of like had like records, like actual records of like the old shadow radio plays. Like I was enough of a huge nerd that I loved radio drama and all that stuff from the 30s and 40s and 50s. And so I was like, that's awesome. But you know what's funny is that we realized that we actually had this recording. We had the original cast doing the show. So this is a troupe of actors that had already done the show a dozen times, right, or more, doing the play, just reading it essentially. And so we took that and then we approached Bobby Cronin, who's this extremely talented composer that Crystal's done a bunch of musicals with, like Marion Max and a bunch of others. And he very graciously agreed to recut the show, the audio, into what you heard, right, into episodes, and actually added music. He wrote all that music you heard is original to our show. And so it just gives so much richness and so much excitement to a story that frankly not too many people know about, and more should.
Yeah, I kind of feel like I might have heard the name, but I don't know that I did, you know?
Sure.
And actually you guys said that in the email, the most famous comic creator you never heard of. I was gonna listen to everything and I saw you guys are gonna trickle them down over
Weekly.
time.
Mhm.
Yeah, we should talk about that if it's not a spoiler or not. But I suppose people know, right, at this point.
It's
Like,
history.
yeah, people will know. It's not like, you know, there's gonna be something new revealed. So he, just so that I can understand, this cat created or co-created these characters that, like the ones we're seeing. Because I'll, you know, full disclosure, I'm fairly new to comics. I always preferred books,
Sure.
you know, and I always try to get my hand on comic books, so to speak, novels of the stories.
Okay.
You know,
Sure. Like prose novel adaptations and stuff.
correct. I always
Sure.
preferred that.
Okay.
And only recently, and by recently I mean like ever since the whole Avengers things came out, right? Since that stuff came out, I said I want to know these stories more, and I've always wanted to. And I kind of said, well, I have no choice. If I really want to know the real story, I'm gonna have to read a comic, right? And
Right.
I just found it very hard to read. So I went and got myself an iPad, got myself a comic book reader, and well, I also tried with my physical comics, and I just gave it a chance because I always found it distracting. But I just
Okay.
gave it a chance, and then I really got into it.
Oh, that's
So now,
great. I mean, comics are a kind of visual literacy, right? You know, I mean, I remember I'd been reading them since I was 4, but it's like learning the alphabet, right? You've got to learn a whole new way of kind of storytelling. You know, like the most common thing. I don't know if this was part of your challenge, but one thing I get, because I teach a lot and I sort of go around the world and talk to people, I do get people who are like, do I look at the pictures first, or do I read the balloons first, or is it change, and so on and so forth? And
well, it was the sequence of the balloons I found confusing. Which one am I supposed to read? You
Right.
know, what's happening? I just want to consume the story. I never
Right.
cared for the pictures, you know.
Sure.
And even now I'm able to read it, but I find that I don't focus so much on the pictures,
Right.
which I guess is it's kind of a disservice to the artwork of it. And I've been trying to get understand it more. It just it's different for me. Like I'd always just want to see the letters and get the story, you know. But
Right.
I
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I
And I mean,
enjoy them.
and that's part of the challenge for somebody like Jack Kirby, right? Who is an artist. Now, you know, Kirby was legendary for his output. He could draw 9 pages a day, which, you know, these days you're lucky if you get an artist who can do a page a day or a page every 2 days. Um, and but his legacy, his claim to fame sort of got overwhelmed by the guy who was known as his writer, who's Stan Lee, right? Who's was the editor of Marvel and is the avuncular kind of guy with the mustache and the glasses you see in cameos in all the movies until he passed away a few years ago.
Stan was more just writing and
Right. Well, but you see, there's a lot of evidence that he wasn't even doing that. He was directing. He was the boss, right? And he's saying, okay, like, for example, let's say, you know, because Kirby was the first artist on the Avengers, for example. And Lee worked, because they had about a dozen different titles, and Lee, quote unquote, wrote all of them. And he would do something called the Marvel method, which is we'd basically call up the cartoonist and say, okay, in this issue, just for example, let's have the Avengers fight, I don't know, Doctor Doom, right? Kirby also co-created / created Dr. Doom. And Kirby would have to sit there and just draw a story. There was no script, right? There was no like written instruction. It was all these phone calls or these personal meetings. Like Kirby lived in Long Island, right? And he would take the train in to Manhattan and meet with Lee, and they'd talk it over face to face. But then Kirby would go off and in a few weeks draw 20 pages of the Avengers fighting Dr. Doom, and he would write little notes in the margins of the boards about what the character should say. Then he'd bring the artwork, drop it off in Manhattan to the offices, and Lee would put in the words. As far as I know, he dictated them to secretary, or he dictated them directly to the letterer. There was not a lot of actual like writing, like whether it's typing or longhand or anything like that. But one thing Lee did that was very effective, and I think did go a long way to making Marvel Comics as successful as they were, was he would talk to you like a narrator in the captions and in the letter columns and in his editorials they would have in all the comics. And so the one thing leading the through line between all the comics, right, was this guy Stan Lee. In fact, even after Stan Lee stopped writing and working for the company directly, there was a period when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s that every Marvel comic said Stan Lee presents, Amazing Spider-Man, or Stan Lee presents, G.I. Joe, a real American hero, which was crazy because Stan Lee had nothing to do with the creation of G.I. Joe. That was Hasbro, as Stan Lee presents Star Wars, you know what I mean? Like Stan Lee didn't do Star Wars, but Marvel published the Star Wars comics, and they wanted to, Marvel wanted to have that through line. And so when, of course, the movies started coming out, the filmmakers would have Stan Lee, people don't know, Alfred Hitchcock was the director who first started this. Like Alfred Hitchcock would appear in all the movies that, or at least started very early on to appear in all the movies that he directed. And so that became a thing that became part of the marketing, right, of the Alfred Hitchcock movies, is where does Alfred Hitchcock show up, to the point where we actually had a TV show called Alfred Hitchcock Presents. But anyway.
Great show, by the way. I love that guy's stuff.
And so Stan Lee became sort of the Alfred Hitchcock of the Marvel movies, and that he started to show up and had in people. That was one of the things people were showing up to the theater to sort of wait for, is how and when and what context is Stan Lee going to show up. Sadly, that extra level of movie fame meant that Stan Lee kind of ended up he really got played by a series of kind of cheap hustlers and grifters toward the end of his life. And so the end of Stan Lee's life is not really a great story, but ironically, this happened after he sort of overwhelmed Jack Kirby and some of the other creators, most famously Steve Ditko, who's the guy who co-created Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. And to the point where I think if you ask the average person who created the Marvel Universe, a lot of them would go, what? Most people go, huh? What do you mean? But I think those people would give you an answer, would say Stan Lee, because he's sort of the face of the franchise, right? Just sort of like how Walt Disney, by appearing in the Disneyland TV show and his public appearances, sort of got fixated with a bunch of movies that, to be honest with you, he didn't really have a whole lot to do with. Stan Lee was sort of the mascot of Marvel.
Okay. I apologize for that. Completely, totally not expected. But I think we got a stove. I think we have a functional stove. We'll know. If you don't see this episode up and you see some story on the news about a Queen's apartment, both
in flames.
Yeah, then you see a Stan Lee throughput. And as he recorded the podcast, the stove exploded.
Right. Angel went home to his home planet.
How did you get interested in this artist? Like, how did it come about that? Because it sounds, from what you're telling me, that it's almost like he got shafted.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's exciting. I mean, through the next 4 episodes of the King Kirby podcast, you will learn all about it. So
cool.
Fear not, it is coming your way quite quickly, and in a very dramatic and exciting and entertaining fashion, I might add. Yeah. So what happened? So I grew up in the 70s, which was right when which was in the aftermath of Jack Kirby leaving Marvel Comics. And so what Marvel did was they put out a bunch of books by Stan Lee. It said by Stan Lee on the cover, called with titles like Origins of Marvel Comics, Son of Origin, and all that stuff, where basically more Stan Lee gives his side of the story of the creating of Marvel Comics. And while nothing in there is necessarily lies that I'm aware of, it does leave out a bunch of stuff, namely what I was referring to earlier, which is that, I mean, part of the problem is that when you're 8, right, and somebody tells you something, you believe it, right? And that's when I was reading these books, you know. Then when I got older and when I got into writing myself, and for that matter, when I became a professional comic book writer, I realized, wait, what I get paid to do is not what Stan Lee got paid to do. I work. He tells somebody, you do this, and that's it. And then he picks up the check for writing. I also used to work in the United Nations Pension Fund, and that's called in the pension world double dipping, right? Where you're getting a pension, but you also have a salary from some other job you're doing that's not related, when you're supposed to be retired, right? So Stan Lee was essentially double dipping, but he was this very avuncular character. He was very good. He had a very good ear for a specific kind of dialogue and kind of self-deprecating humor. The superheroes all had layers to them. They were all sort of tortured, right? Spider-Man is the most famous example of that, of a superhero who's got, as they said in the 60s, super problems, right? You know, Batman is a rich guy who has models dripping off his arm. Spider-Man can barely afford his rent and is constantly hustling to afford to buy his girlfriend dinner, you know. And while Stan did not, I'm not saying Stan didn't contribute anything to the comics, he was sort of like, I mean, what's a good example? He's almost like the factory owner that takes full credit for all the work that the other people are doing. And also when, you know, it's a little bit different when the factory is comprised of like 2 people, right? Stan Lee created all these great comics, quote unquote, from this period in the 60s, right? When Jack Kirby was working for him, when Steve Ditko was working for him. But then when Jack Kirby quit in 1969, suddenly Stan Lee's creative output essentially ends, right? Well, Kirby went on to create all these great characters, like, for example, the Zack Snyder Justice League cut drop. The trailer dropped over the weekend.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, I did see that, yeah.
The big characters featuring that were Darkseid, totally created by Jack Kirby, you know, after he left Marvel, after he was working with Stan Lee. Steppenwolf, the villain in Justice League, also created by Jack Kirby after he left Marvel and after he left Stan Lee. You know, the next big Marvel movie is going to be the Eternals, also 100% created by Jack Kirby, wrote and drew after he left DC and came back to Marvel, while Stan Lee's creative output pretty much begins and ends with Stripperella, a 1-season Pamela Anderson cartoon, you know. So, but you know, he, in the 80s when they made cartoons out of the Marvel comics, Stan Lee was the narrator, and this sort of became a trend where Stan was essentially, the unkind way to put it would be, Stan Lee is the Ronald McDonald of, you know, Marvel comics, right? He's the face, he's the mascot, he's the Chuck E. Cheese. But you know, famously, Marvel, you know, he didn't really have any ownership of the characters, so he got he had a contract with Marvel at the end of the year that supposedly paid him $1 million every year, basically just to be a brand ambassador. And he had a wife, and I'm not telling any stories at the school, but he had a family that spent all his money essentially. And the money that his family didn't spend, he had a bunch of grifters and con artists kind of surround him, and they took that. And so it's a really, really a very sad story. But Jack Kirby didn't get a dime until actually, and the heirs sued Disney. And in fact, the year King Kirby, Our Play was first put on is the year that Disney settled with the Kirby heirs. The Supreme Court actually was going to hear the case. And now you see Jack Kirby's name in the credits for the Avengers movies. And a lot of
But this was after he was gone.
Yeah, Kirby died in 1993, I believe.
So while he was alive, he wasn't properly credited for his stuff?
And he didn't get a dime.
Jesus Christ.
Except for the page rate, you know, when he literally just turned in the art. Stan Lee at least got $1 million a year. Now, I will point out that Stan Lee got ripped off too. Like, that $1 million a year, if he was in fact the co-creator, is nowhere near the amount of money he should be getting. But at least he got $1 million a year. But then his family owned the company. Like, there was a lot going on there. So yeah, so they got shafted. So Kirby got shafted. Steve Ditko, who created Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, got shafted.
Is he also passed? Oh, we're still around.
Yeah, all these folks died very recently. Steve Ditko died last year.
Oh,
Stanley died
wow.
2 years ago.
Is it kind of like when you work for a company, what you create is actually theirs? Is that the scenario that happened here?
Yeah, legally that's
Yeah.
called work for hire.
Right,
But
right.
the work for hire laws, don't forget the work for hire laws that you and I operate under today did not get passed until 1976. And all the major creations of the Marvel Universe, and for that matter, the DC Universe that Kirby was also involved in, that all happened prior to 76. So even if it was by our current standards work for hire, those standards didn't exist legally prior to 1976. And this is why Disney was freaking out, obviously, about the Supreme Court hearing Kirby's case. Because if the Supreme Court ruled that either A, you had to pay all these people who created stuff for you prior to 1976, or B, worse, that some of the stuff would be, public domain. Bye-bye Mickey Mouse, Goofy, Donald Duck, the whole gang, right? So they would have completely screwed themselves. So Disney opened up the vault. And the Kirby heirs, what Kirby should have gotten, one hopes, while he was alive.
Wow. We have any idea what the family got in that type of settlement, or is it undisclosed?
It's non-disclosure agreements, yeah. So
right.
We have no legal recourse to find out, but it is reportedly substantial.
Well, good. I mean, damn, that sucks. I mean, that he wasn't around, but at least his his children and grandchildren, family, at least somebody will benefit.
Yeah, exactly.
And isn't it crazy how these companies, they're they're dirty the way they do things, and it's bizarre, man. And I mean that whole thing, like my son was telling me about, because he got into it a little bit before me, and he's telling me, oh, they can't use this character because they don't own this character, they sold this character.
Sure.
And I'm just like, what the hell,
Most
man?
have consolidated now, though, since Disney bought Fox, because Fox, they had sold off. Marvel had sold off the rights to X-Men and Fantastic Four to Fox, right? 20th Century Fox, and then Sony still has technically the Spider-Man license.
That's what the whole beef was with Spider-Man being in the MCU and everything that they were talking about. And
yeah, a whole army of lawyers had to sit down and hash that stuff out like it was a Middle East peace agreement. And for those of you who are watching WandaVision, they've brought that whole conflict into the actual MCU in the sense that Quicksilver's rights, for whatever reason, Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch are technically X-Men villains. That's how they started out existence, co-created once again by Jack Kirby. However, Wanda became almost exclusively associated with the Avengers, while Quicksilver kind of split his time between Avengers and X-Men. So bizarrely, Fox had the rights to do Quicksilver, but then so did Marvel, and they sort of had a hostility agreement to
not non-compete.
or you could compete, right? So you had a Quicksilver in Age of Ultron, which is a Marvel movie that got killed off in that movie.
Right.
But then there was another Quicksilver who appeared in Days of Future Past, in Evan Peters, who is alive, and he is the version that shows up in WandaVision.
Which is very weird. I thought that, what the hell? I haven't seen the last episode, but I saw the one prior where he shows up in the end and he says, "Who's this?" I forget what the word, meet something. He said something about Vision, but I was like, why'd they bring this guy? I don't understand. Like, it's all very confusing.
Yes, you need sort of they want you to watch other movies, right? They want you to get your money's worth out of your Disney Plus account and rewatch all that stuff. Although I'm not sure the X-Men movies are actually on Disney Plus yet. But anyway, so it's weird. Fantastic Four is now back with Marvel. Punisher, a bunch of all those other characters that sort of have their rights. The Hulk is a weird case. The Hulk his solo movies are technically owned by Universal, his rights. So that's why there's only been that. I think they have to pay Universal to do a Hulk solo movie, which is why.
They only did the one.
Only did the one with I'm blanking on the guy's name. Ed Norton.
Right.
Norton. But yet Hulk can appear in all of these. I worked for the Marvel video games for a long time, and so there were all these arcane legal things like the Submariners Namor's rights are completely screwed up. Like that also has to do with Universal, and we couldn't put Submariner in a video game, but he could be in a floor wax, or he could appear in a breakfast cereal, but not in Play-Doh or Weedo. It's all these arcane licensing agreements.
Wow.
You know what I mean? It just will melt your brain.
Wow, this stuff is bizarre.
And all this sort of comes from the fact, as you mentioned earlier, that these corporations don't play well together, and they certainly don't play well with actual individual humans who aren't rich enough to have an army of lawyers protect their interests, which people like Jack Kirby absolutely didn't have, and that's really the whole subject of our podcast.
Right, right. Now you say you do comics as well. Do you then take steps? Are you creating new characters and stuff, or like 20 years from now we'll see your characters in some big movie scene, and are you protected? Like, what do you do? How do you handle that?
If you've seen Age of Ultron, you've already seen a character I co-created. Her name was Helen Cho, and she's a major character in that film. And Marvel did compensate me for that. Part of the whole scandal, I mean, I did not, make that much money off of it, but I made some money. I made more money off of that than Kirby ever got.
Wow. For his entire thing, that's
literally almost everyone else who appears in the Avengers. Age of Ultron, except for Ultron himself and Helen Cho. I think actually every single other character in there was more or less created by Jack Kirby. Yeah, pretty much. Black Widow's more of a gray area. But anyway, yeah, and you'll be seeing more of my characters when they do the MODOK show on Hulu later this year. So there's been reform. There's been some reform in the comic book industry since the controversy of Jack Kirby trying to get his rights back, which dated really back to the late 70s and the 80s, really since this 1976 law was passed. But it's still not great. As with most things in capitalism, the bankers are making more money than anyone else. Just the system that's been set up.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and then you also have a situation which, as someone who has successfully sued someone non-comics related, unless you can bilk somebody for a fair amount of money, that's the only way people who aren't rich can afford representation in court. Because unless the law firm, there's no reason for a law firm to take your case if you're not paying them hundreds of dollars an hour if they don't accept some fairly substantial, like 6-figure payday at the end. So it hurts everybody, but it makes just enough people rich that there's not a big clamor to change it. Because I'm a working creative person, I have a lot of interest in both sort of the history of making art and making entertainment. And I think a lot of people have this idea that just faceless, that our pop culture kind of comes from like a factory or something, right? It just kind of gets spat out. It's not like you go to a museum and look at a painting and go, oh, Rembrandt.
It's a Rembrandt, right?
Exactly. That we're supposed to like herald and hold up this this fine art, right? While entertainment is kind of this low junk.
You guys did express that in the beginning of it. That was very prominent.
That's right. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. In the very beginning of it, it was, this isn't really art, but, here it is in the bidding, like it was being kind of snubbed.
That's right. Yeah, that dialogue, well, that scene is set during an actual auction at Sotheby's that happened in the 90s, right after Kirby died.
Oh, so that person really said that?
No, I inartfully phrased that. No, that's a fictional character, but the actual auction is real.
Oh, okay. I thought you had actual audio.
There is later on you'll hear a lot of actual dialogue from actual people, but that's not one of them.
It was definitely entertaining, and I'm excited to to see where it goes.
Awesome.
But I did gather that I mean, not from what I heard at the moment, but from my reading and stuff, that my man got shafted, which that kind of blows. But
that is an accurate way to put it.
I mean, it's happened historically to so many artists, music-wise, right? I mean, even as recent as like look at Mike Tyson, how he was kind of, and I'm sure it still happens even now.
Well, I mean, Britney Spears, it took her this long to be freed of her father, and all the control that he had over her life and her her royalties and everything else, so it's constant, it's that you have creative people have certain talents that are then exploited by people whose talents are in exploitation. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like that's kind of unfortunately what it comes down to. Is it's very rare. You very rarely have someone like Kanye West or Dr. Dre or somebody who has that simultaneous ability to be both dominant on the business side and dominant on the creative side.
Right. I have a song that was put in a film in India,
Okay.
and it what was it? I was featured in a song, right? They didn't give me a penny.
Right.
Now I'm thinking, based on the 50 million views that video has and the success of that film, that I should be recognized.
It's class action suit time. You too can get 100 rupees.
Yeah,
Royalties.
I had like maybe like 6 or 7 lines in the beginning of the song, and in the middle of the song, I think I had another 6 or 7 lines. But I didn't get.
Singing, or were you playing an instrument, or?
No, it was verbal. It's a Hindi song on the soundtrack, and I just did a couple of like rap lines.
Oh, cool.
And they kept them in there, but they did credit me in the album, like you see my name featuring A-Rod or whatever.
Right.
But like I don't get any royalties for that, and I always wondered if that was something that I should be entitled to or whatever. But I just never really acted on it. But
well, I mean, unfortunately, the bottom line, and again, this is also sort of part of the Kirby story, is that a lot of times contracts are worth only the amount of money you invest in enforcing them. Particularly if you're dealing with people who do not have your best interests at heart, or for that matter, a lot of times it's just indifference. They think you're too minuscule to bother with, unfortunately. And I get that too, in various dealings in my life. And like anything else in life, you got to pick your battles.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I can beat a Hindi movie studio.
Beat Bollywood their own game.
Yeah, I don't think I could beat Bollywood. So I kind of just whatever. I put it on my blog, featured in this massive movie song. But it is a movie. It's in a movie, and the soundtrack and stuff. But
right.
I don't know. I just never. My friends were like, "Well, did you get paid for it?" I was like, "No." He's like, "What, are you crazy? It's royalties, blah blah." I'm like, "Oh, I don't know nothing about that."
Right. It's a frequent story.
Such is life, right? Is there anything you want to share before we close for the audience, or anything else that you want to throw out there?
Just search King Kirby in iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. If you're interested in more of my work, you can check me out on Twitter at Fred Van Lente. I'm also on Facebook at Fred Van Lente, and fredvanlente.com. Soon I'm going to be starting a newsletter so people can sign up and be notified whenever I got new stuff dropping, which is frequently.
Yeah, very cool. I'm definitely going to check all that out. Listen, thank you for coming on the podcast. Apologies for the dog running around and screaming and the explosions in the background.
It's all good.
Awesome.
Cool. Thanks, Angel.
All right. Yeah, thank you, man. I appreciate you taking the time.
Enjoy.
Peace.
You are listening to the NYC Talking podcast. www.nyctalking.com. Please like NYC Talking on Facebook. Please follow Angel R Talk on Twitter and Instagram. We are NYC Talking, the realest lifestyle blog ever. Thanks for listening.